of you guys knew that we existed before coming to this conference? Okay, good. So that means there's new converts in the audience. Okay, great. But our budget was so small. We're funded by the state. Our budget was so small up until 2018 that we didn't have any staff member. We were all volunteers. So as you can imagine, we get so much better with just volunteers. And then we were able to get an increase from the legislature because we are state funded. In 2018, we got an increase to be able to hire staff. And that's I'm the staff, by the way. I'm the entire staff. Okay, so but now we're able to get more outreach into communities throughout South Carolina, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a moment. Today, obviously, we're looking at a specific topic here that was the title of this session: the danger of a single story in teaching difficult history. Okay, and from the librarian's angle, thinking about what types of books you're selecting to include in your libraries. Or for teachers as well, what types of texts they're using. So all those things come into consideration here, and we'll talk about all of those during this presentation. The one thing you might have recognized, the danger of a single story. Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah, so very famous. It became a TED Talk eventually. And it's by Chimamanda, I can say it incorrectly, Chimamanda Adichie. And unfortunately, as we know, the Wi-Fi is not the greatest here, but I did bring a transcript of this video. It's all a 3-minute video. The original video, actually, the whole TED Talk, I think is somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes. But this one is a condensed version. And if you wouldn't mind just reading through this, it's just the front of the page to hear her story. Okay, as we look at this story, what stands out to you from this story? Or what's maybe kind of a message that she's trying to convey?
There are stereotypes that we adhere to.
There are stereotypes we embrace often, okay? And we can get into this idea of, is that our fault? Is that human nature? What's happening here, okay? What potentially is a reason why we embrace stereotypes, do you think? It's the only thing we see. It's the only thing we know. It's easy, right? We want to be able to process things as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And so it's easier simply to take this one little piece of knowledge that you have, whether or not it's true or not, doesn't really matter, and just label somebody or some group as being, that's all who they are, okay? Anything else comes through in this particular story? Yes, I think what's great about this particular story and how she does it, and she goes further than this, obviously, in her full TED Talk, is it's really about everybody. We as human beings are this way. It isn't just me thinking about my experience with first meeting Americans, as she talks about, going to American University, and then them seeing me as an African and thinking X, Y, Z things, right? As she mentioned. It's really me projecting too onto Fide's family, as she mentions. He's poor, right? So I just pity him. That's all. I didn't think that they could do anything special because they were poor, right? So the whole point of why I wanted to use this particular video, this is her right here, is to start talking about this idea of how we limit ourselves in our understanding of people, both of individuals, which we're mainly focused on individuals in the first half of our discussion, but then collectively as historical events too, how that impacts our perspective of those events, and as a result of that impact, when we convey that same message to students, we are doing them a disservice. We are providing them with an incomplete picture of what's happening. Okay? So 2 basic points we're going to look at here today. One is that the danger of a single story is that it provides an incomplete narrative. An incomplete narrative to what's happening here. So I had you look at this question sheet here. Oh, actually, you. And those first few names there you see, that might stand out to you, certainly. Everybody probably has heard of at least, I would say most of these, right? At some point in time. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we are going to talk about a few of them more specifically here. So let's just start with Columbus. What stands out to you about Columbus? First thing in your mind. Explorer, right? What's that? What did you say?
Murderer.
Murderer. Okay. Now, interesting point there. So you bring up murderer. Now, 40 years ago, if you were educated 40 years ago about Columbus, do you think you would say that? No. That whole side of that reality of what Columbus comes with, okay, is very different nowadays, right? I think we've worked effectively to try to challenge that singular narrative of who Columbus is, okay? It doesn't, however, mean that we take away this other part of what we knew him to be originally.
I would say false.
What's that?
I would say false, because he's not the first European Jewish.
Oh yeah, you also have that issue too. The debates about how important really was he, that sort of thing. Even during his time period, just as a side note, he wasn't even seen as that important, comparatively speaking to other explorers. Right? Like Amerigo Vespucci was actually much more famous than he was.
Yes.
So interesting sort of aside. Now we'll go to the one on the bottom. Kanye. Let's start with him, since he's been prolific. Let's use that word. So what do we know about Kanye? Most people, all these things, right? Very successful rapper, music producer, entrepreneur, and worth $400 million. Actually, that was over $1 billion a few months ago. Has dropped. We'll talk about that in a second.
Crazy.
Multiple Grammy Awards, so very much recognizable for achievements, great achievements within the fields that he, I know, especially in music, but then later on as an entrepreneur of his own clothing brand. He had a contract with Adidas for his sneakers and all that sort of stuff, and other clothing issues. So, but as we have seen in the past couple of years, especially in the fall of this year, or fall of 2022, he has become, unfortunately for himself, known for other things, okay, and garnered attention in other ways. This tweet famously attacking Jewish people because he felt like they as a collective had called him out for certain things. And then he says, I can't be anti-Semitic because black people are also Jewish. So there's a lot of convoluted things going on here, by the way. Okay. And so DEF CON, what he's referring to there, I don't know if you understand that, he's referring to DEF CON, DEFCON, like the military grades of when they go to war. So I don't know if it was just because he was tweeting or whatever it was. Okay. But he's had several anti-Semitic statements come out in the fall of 2022. These aren't the first time he's done that. We've seen things that happening earlier. He actually went on the Alex Jones InfoWars show in the fall as well and proclaimed that Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. Basically, he had some things right, all that sort of thing. So very problematic statements, to say the least. Okay. But what we know about Kanye, and just his tweets alone, we know that he has over 30 million followers on Twitter. 30 million followers. That's almost double the amount of Jewish people who live in the world. Okay. So even though some people say, oh, Kanye's a little crazy, everybody knows he's a little off his rocker. Okay. Those 30 million people who follow him on Twitter, you can't say every one of those people know he's off his rocker a little bit. Okay. They potentially could be influenced by him, and they are. And we have had and heard of incidences in schools throughout the United States of kids who looked up to Kanye becoming anti-Semitic and committing anti-Semitic acts. Okay? So the complete story about Kanye is much more complex because we can't dismiss his success, but we also have to recognize this as part of it. Okay? So that's a more contemporary person here. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, if not one of, if not the most acclaimed of the founding fathers, one of them certainly. Third U.S. president, author of the Declaration of Independence, well, the primary author of it. While he was president, oversaw the Louisiana Purchase, which increased the territory of the United States by over half. Helped to found the University of Virginia, on and on and on. What else do we know about Thomas Jefferson that maybe is not on this list, that maybe doesn't look so glowingly about Thomas Jefferson? Slave owner. Yeah, slavery. Enslaved over 600 people. Believed African Americans, and we have his writings to prove this, were biologically inferior to whites, and the two could not coexist peacefully together. And fathered multiple children with his slave, Sally Hemings. This has been proven, essentially. So, what do we think about when we navigate this with students? Do we focus just on this, or do we focus on the other side? The reality is that we need to kind of incorporate and understand that students need to understand both. Okay? It's important that they recognize the whole picture, just like an event and an individual, same idea. If they can know more about the individual, they can better understand the individual, the time period in which they live. They can understand a little bit more of the Declaration of Independence when they say we the people. When Jefferson says we the people in the Declaration of Independence, what does he mean by the people? Now, his version of people is different. We need to recognize that. Okay? So, based upon his writings, we can tell that that's part of the reality, and so that helps us understand as well when they go to write the Constitution some years later. Why they work in kind of why they have these debates about are the enslaved peoples going to count as full voting Americans, that sort of thing, or count towards the total population when we get the House of Representatives, all that sort of stuff. So 3/5 compromise comes from that, all that sort of thing. Right? So it's complex. It's tough. It's tough history. It's difficult history. But we need to kind of make sure we are addressing these issues here. Let's talk about Henry Ford. Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company, obviously one of the most successful automobile manufacturers in the world in history, revolutionized the concept of mass production. He was really a pioneer in that effort. He wasn't the first to do it, but he was really the one who showed how it could be done most efficiently at the time, specifically for manufacturing automobiles. He was also pretty progressive in terms of worker pay, increasing the pay up to $5 for an 8-hour day, when prior to that, the average pay was $2.34 for a 9-hour day. Okay? So that's a significant increase, right? Significant improvement. Does anyone else know anything else about Henry Ford? Yes?
He liked to hire people from the Middle East so that he wouldn't get Jews.
He liked to hire people from the Middle East, so what?
So that he wasn't hiring Jews.
Yes, he did have a streak of anti-Semitism. I wouldn't even say a streak, I would say a tendency toward anti-Semitism, if you will. He's outspoken anti-Semite. He promoted his anti-Jewish views in his newspaper that he actually purchased, some newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which basically he circulated all throughout all the dealerships, Ford dealerships all across the nation had these newspapers. And expressed admiration for Hitler and even accepted an award from the Nazi regime in 1938. Okay, so he was really kind of one of those people who you would say was an influential person who had a lot of people who followed him, and through his influence, and this time period obviously is very different from now. He wasn't tweeting back then, but through his influence, people certainly did take stock of what he had to say and take it more seriously than others may have. And he also waged a long battle against unionization of labor, almost opposing his plan because of his opposition to it. So he did increase the workers' pay, but he was like, here, I'll take care of you. You don't need any unions. So we're not going to get into the debate about union or not, all that sort of thing. But later on, eventually, kind of essentially said, no, I don't want to really be helping the workers in that way. I'll help them in my own way, sort of scenario there. Okay, so again, do we dismiss this? Do we focus on this? No, we balance it, hopefully. Okay? We recognize that Henry Ford is emblematic, quite frankly, of his times to a degree, where there were much more virulent anti-Semitism at that time in the United States and other places in the world. And he was one who was very successful, yet also had these particular viewpoints that today we would see, A, are not good viewpoints to have, hopefully, and B, might be treated or looked at very differently if he was in the same position today, right? But back then, he was allowed and not really, it wasn't really spoken out. I was spoken about that. Next one, Oskar Schindler. Anybody know who Oskar Schindler is? Schindler's List, right? The film Schindler's List probably most famously brought him to light. Oskar Schindler, that movie was actually based upon a book by Thomas Keneally, written earlier in the 80s. He's credited with saving approximately 1,200 Jews from death during the Holocaust, protecting them from the brutality of life in concentration camps by housing them, essentially not necessarily housing them, later on he was, but in his factory, he was able to keep them employed there, which kept them out of the daily life in the concentration camp. Spent much of his profits that he made off of these factories during the war to protect Jews during the final years of the war. Okay? And declared righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, very distinguished honor. Okay? So, certainly someone the students, you would encourage people to look up to as a savior in that sense. Okay. However, he's a difficult person. If you've seen the movie, what's some difficulties with Schindler the person? Anybody? Any character flaws? If you remember from the film.
It's been years since I've seen it.
What's that?
I haven't seen it.
Haven't seen it in a while? Okay. Well, famously, he's a womanizer. Okay. He is married, but he cheats on his wife several times, throughout their marriage. Additionally, he's probably borderline alcoholic at different points in time in his life. But how did he get all these workers? We need to remember that. He was a member of the Nazi Party. Does this mean he believed all of the ideology? No, it doesn't. He obviously didn't. He was an opportunist. He was a businessman looking for an opportunity. Member of the Nazi Party, war profiteer of forced and slave labor, which is why you see at the end of the film he's saying that he has to flee, he has to leave, because he's going to be hunted down as a war profiteer. And he contributes to the Nazi regime financially through his business throughout the war. Now, in a really kind of difficult juxtaposition, his ability to make these connections with the Nazi Party early on and be a supporter of them in that sense, later on is going to help him actually be able to save these people. So, again, a very difficult sort of challenging aspect here. We want to focus certainly on who he was as a hero, a heroic figure, and that should be a focus. But even if you had your students maybe in high school watch clips of the film, they could easily see that he's also not just an upstanding guy the whole time, right? That he kind of eventually has this kind of conversion of sorts of his own moral conversion to I need to be doing more for these people, So again, this reality that life is not lived in black and white, really by anybody. We can pretty much go back to most historic figures and say very few of them are Mother Teresa, right? So we kind of have to remember that there is no single story that we should be promoting. Right? It's diverse. Okay. So overall, and certainly the others I mentioned on this list, Muhammad Ali, famous boxer, right, becomes very well known. Also evades the draft, right? He gets imprisoned for that. That's an interesting sort of thing that you could talk to students about that. He stood up for what he believed was right. And at that time, maybe he's nowadays, maybe we would say that's probably the right thing to do based upon, especially since the Vietnam War went south and it didn't really look good for us. Richard Nixon, famously, what's the most famous thing about Richard Nixon? Watergate, right? Okay, of course, Watergate, awful period in our history, but we can't discount the fact that he had a lot of success as president in terms of some of his foreign policy. Not really, not, but in terms of his connections, his ability to kind of move into détente, which is going to reduce the tensions that were existing in the Cold War at that time. So we can't necessarily throw that out, right? And just focus on that one thing, even though we often will remember that one thing a little bit more. So what we need to try to remember here, the challenge, as Mike Conway of the Atlantic says, currently most students learn history as a set narrative, a process that reinforces the mistaken idea of the past to be synthesized to a single standardized chronicle of several hundred pages. It's just not that easy. It just is not that easy. Okay? You need to kind of recognize that most of these events, especially the most difficult events to discuss, like the Holocaust and so forth, have a lot of intricacies to them, a lot of complexity to them. So let's not simplify everything just because it's easier for us to understand. Sometimes it's just as well for us to get in there, get into the complexities of it, and leave students walking away with questions more than all the answers, because they're never going to have all the answers. I still don't have all the answers. I've been studying this for 20 years. So it still is, in some ways, confusing to me to a degree. Okay. So when you think about content selection, and therefore think about text selection as well, you need to think about several different aspects of this. Obviously addressing the South Carolina standards, if you're talking about social studies standards, certainly. Comprehensive narratives, one that offer kind of really gets at more than just this heroic sort of image of a person. Talks about other aspects of their life, hopefully that provides them with a more true or balanced understanding, so to speak. Individual stories and biographies, okay, again, a little bit more depth to them. Age-appropriate selections, obviously, you're all very aware of all these things. And recognition of valid, diverse perspectives, okay? Not just throwing a diversity in there for the sake of it, but who you bring in and how you're using that diversity to balance out what you're talking about here. Okay, now, so that was kind of one point I wanted to make. The second one was this issue of insufficient viewpoints to a degree. The danger of a single story, because it does not offer that diversity to a degree, but also multiple aspects or viewpoints here. Now, these are some famous texts that you may recognize. Some of you may recognize, others you may not. Really from the 80s and 90s, and I guess into the 2000s a little bit here. So let's start with the bell curve. Anybody know about the bell curve? Very famous text. What was the basic supposition of the bell curve? Anybody know? What was the basic claim, the argument, I should say? Placed a lot of emphasis. Basically, it said that all people can be fit into this bell curve. This idea that there's the elite at the top, and there's the weak at the bottom, and then most people are in between. Okay? And that's really referring to IQ. It basically leans on IQ as the predominant factor to determine someone's success. It has been heavily criticized and critiqued since then, but it still prevails. It was so popular at the time when it came out that this notion still prevails that IQ is where it's at in some circles. The reality is most people have come to understand, many people have come to understand, well, there's a lot of other factors there too. Okay? So there might be reasons why you have a high IQ. It might be environmental factors too, as to what plays a role there. It might be family background, all these sort of things that play into it. It's too easy to simply push that one narrative. And because often when you look at this demographically, when it breaks down, when you see how the populations actually filter out, this becomes a very discriminatory sort of thing to use, okay? Because you see certain populations that are predominantly in the lower half, and truly we're supposed to assume that IQ is more balanced, okay? We come to find that that's not always the case. So that's one particular narrative, so to speak. Cultural literacy, have you ever heard that one? Edie Hirsch, cultural literacy, what every American should know. It was seen to be kind of progressive because it's talking about cultural literacy, right? This is back in kind of mainly in the 90s, and this has become popular. But one of the challenges is like, how could you define that? Basically, he's trying to claim that these are all the things that Americans need to know. Okay, how do you define that and say that you know what's right for everybody to know? You know, that sort of thing. And so again, that one particular singular view, this is the way, so to speak. If you're familiar with Mandalorian, right? Yeah. This is the way. You know, so if you follow this, and therefore that'll give you everything you need to know in terms of these are the important Americans you need to know, historically speaking. These are the movements you need to know, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And in it, obviously, it opens itself up to a lot of critique and criticism because of the reality, like, you know, there's no way you can define that. We try to, even with state standards, and that's even impossible, right? And then you have this one, Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. Anybody ever see this book before? Hear Zinn? Yeah. Some of you may have seen it. Okay.
There's a young adult version of that.
Yeah.
There is now a young adult version of that. So if it depends upon what particular news outlet you're listening to or watching or hearing from, but in some outlets they will call Zinn a communist, basically. Because what this does, and again, A People's History, it essentially tells the story of American history from the perspective of the common masses. In such a fashion where it's basically saying, like, yeah, there's some issues here with how American history is taught, where it's taught from the top down. Like, talk about the presidents and what they did and the people in power and all that sort of stuff. Rather than talking about, well, what's the vast majority of people experiencing? What are their lives like? You know, how are their lives being directly impacted or indirectly impacted by the people who are in charge? You know, and is that fair? All that sort of stuff. So obviously, some controversy surrounding that. And we've seen, I know teachers, colleagues who've worked this into their curriculum to try to balance, to use excerpts from this to balance that story out, right? Because the reality is, you know, just like, you know, if you ever heard the phrase, "To the victors go the spoils," when it comes to history, history is written by the winners. Well, in the history of a country, the winners are the people who are in power. And so they write that narrative, and that is established as, that's how we should learn this. This is what we should embrace. So Zinn comes along and says, no. We need to look at everybody else. And so, again, he has a point there, but the question is that point all-encompassing? Or is it just kind of a way to show, hey, here's another perspective that we need to consider when teaching this topic? Next, I'll show you another entity that also is kind of centrally focused on one particular message. I'm assuming some of you have heard about this, the 1619 Project, right? We see this, obviously, all the states that are going through these debates about, you know, teaching, education, like South Carolina, you know, talk about the 1619 Project, because its central narrative or its central focus is that this issue of slavery is a central defining issue in the history of America from its founding, essentially. And even some of the most liberal people out there, scholars, would say, yes, this is an important point that we should take up, but let's be careful not to put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, right? So it's kind of difficult sort of thing. It's not that it shouldn't be addressed. It's not that it shouldn't be potentially thought about, okay? But the fear is, you know, well, this is subverting what we're trying to do, and when we teach a story or teach history and all that sort of thing, okay? So the question is, what should we do about the 1619 Project, about Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, about the bell curve? Do they not have anything to contribute? Should we just push them aside because they are a little bit more singular focused or not? So look at that part 2 here. And on the macro level, with these larger issues, as opposed to a singular event, right? On the macro level, I want you to think about these and maybe turn to somebody next to you or just think about them. These 3 questions here. First one, as you can see, what challenges if we focus, and you can use any one of those examples we talked about, okay, and centering your approach on these frameworks or texts. Okay. would there be any advantages to using them? Why not? What should be done? Now, is this a zero-sum game? What that means, or what that references, is the fact is it the type of thing where you have to either completely go for it, or you have to completely abandon it? Okay. So think about those few questions for the next couple minutes, and then we'll talk. Okay, in the interest of time, let's take a look at these. Anybody have any thoughts here? What challenges or problems do you think exist with focusing on one of these texts or something like it? Anybody have any?
Just being it's that one-sided viewpoint. If you focus on on just like, I'm just gonna use this text and I'm gonna show that to my students, you're
Yeah.
only offering that one side viewpoint.
One side of not just a coin, one side of multiple potential ends. Okay. Anybody else have thoughts on that one?
You also are potentially trying to force a connection where there isn't one,
Yeah.
because that's not your population, that's not your demographic, they don't understand it, and when you gotta make that personal connection with the student and the information, they can't, because that's the only story that you're telling.
Yeah, that's true too. If you only have that one perspective, you're not allowing others in, or you're not understanding what your audience is. That's a great point. Very good. Are there any advantages? Yes.
My undergrad was history, and honestly, I think if opinions, whether they thought they were facts at the time from 30 years ago or 300 years ago, it gives us into a window into the way some people were thinking at that time. And I've had to explain this about fictional books, classic books that I have in the library, that while we have a different appreciation of things now, this is the way people thought back then, and there is some advantage to not trying to erase that, not trying to forget that, to teach that and say, this is how we think now, we have evolved.
Yes. Just because they thought that way doesn't necessarily make that right and or wrong,
And
right?
we don't necessarily think that way now.
Yes.
Here are the new opinions.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.
Anybody else with advantages potentially to using these texts?
I think a lot of kids are so black and white, they really want like okay, tell me something.
Uh-huh.
I can like latch onto
Right.
it.
Sound test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge too, is so much of what we teach is like, we don't have the time to go over everything because we know this is on the test. But at the same time, I think there's an advantage to working with, especially like teens, where they're like, okay, this is black and white. Who's the good guy, who's the bad guy?
Yeah.
And to start with something like that, and then maybe even use a completely different text, not to say, here's the two sides,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
to express, well, had you even thought about this whole
Different
thing?
angle, yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think you're getting at this larger issue of, are we just teaching facts, or are we teaching kids how to think? You know, and I think that's really what our mission is. Hopefully, as educators, we want, because let's all admit the fact that if they want the information, they can get the information, right? Easily. I mean, in 5 seconds or less, they can get the information they need to know about XYZ person or event. You know, so it's this whole regurgitation sort of philosophy that we still continue to exist in is a little problematic, because we need to also get them to the point where they're thinking about these things as well. Okay? So we're going to transition to the micro level now. And in particular, obviously, from my vantage point and teaching the Holocaust, these are the two dominant texts for Holocaust education. Okay? Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, obviously very important text. Elie Wiesel's, his memoir, Night, also extremely important text and extremely good. Very well done. I highly encourage all teachers who want to use them, certainly. Okay? However, it can be limiting. They can be limiting. So if you look at the last set of questions there, what challenge would probably exist with this in terms of exclusively centering your approach on this? And what can and should be done? And we can just talk collectively about that. So what challenge do you think exists with this?
The fact that it is just a micro level. It's one little piece.
It's one person's story. Now, we need students to connect with a story, right? And there's nothing wrong with using those texts as an anchor text, right, for them to connect with. Because quite frankly, in the world today, we know that people understand what you mean when you say Anne Frank, and a lot of people also understand what you mean when you say Elie Wiesel. Okay? But that's not the whole story. That just scratches the surface. That's one person's experience. There were 6 million people who were killed who were Jewish. There are millions more who survived. Okay? What about all those other stories here? Okay? So we need to figure out ways to get people to see these other stories as also valid, equally valid, and important to try to work in within, obviously, the time frame of what students and teachers can accomplish within the classroom, which is also difficult. And so trying to recognize those singular stories are extremely important. We should still be using them. I'm not saying don't use them. Definitely not saying don't use them. Definitely you should use them. They're awesome, amazing stories. But are there ways we can work in others? You know, and quite frankly, based upon the time frame aspect too, do you have to use the whole story? You don't necessarily have to, right? You don't have to have the students read the whole diary. You don't have to have students read the entire memoir. You can pull in excerpts if that affords you more time to also work in other people's experiences. If you just think about Elie Wiesel, he's not impacted by the Holocaust and the events of World War II until 1944. Hitler comes to power in 1933. So there's 11 years of Holocaust history before his family's ever impacted. So a natural question the students are going to have is, why is his family affected and why now? What's been going on? So we can't just assume the Holocaust only occurred during the last 2 years of World War II, 44 and 45. But if we just read that memoir, we might assume that by mistake. Okay, so unfortunately I don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to kind of get you guys to think about this idea of, how can I bring in more diverse stories? And even within the stories that exist about individuals and events, how can I make sure we bring in multiple perspectives to really kind of show the complexities of most of these stories that exist in history, whether they're the Holocaust or not. As an organization, we on our website, scHolocaustCouncil.org, and I'll pass out this flyer to you. We have teacher recommendations. We also have literature recommendations. Oh, you have it already. And a lot of the stuff that we have in terms of recommendations is fairly abridged because you can go to other places like the Holocaust Museum in DC, as well as a variety of other websites to find much more comprehensive list. But we offer a starting point that's digestible for teachers. And quite frankly, there we go.
Yeah, me too.
We focus on nonfiction texts. It's not to say that you can't use fiction. We're not the police of this sort of thing. But we simply feel like there's enough true stories out there. We don't need to pull in other fiction texts and that sort of thing. Okay? I'm happy to talk to you about that, the rationale behind that. Problems with some fiction texts, like Boy in Striped Pajamas. I'm not going to get into it, but I would be happy to have a conversation with you about that. We also have lesson plans on our website. Again, we don't overwhelm teachers with the lesson plans we have, 4 key lesson plans. And the first 2 are actually really good for 5th grade on up. And then the last 2 are more appropriate kind of for 7th grade on up. But those are also on our website. easy to navigate through. The first one's just kind of an overview, guided notes. Comes with a teacher guide and all the answers to the questions and all that sort of thing. Fairly easy to navigate for teachers and students. We also have 37 Holocaust survivors who settled in South Carolina were willing to have their testimonies taken by video. All of them are on our website. Full-length testimonies, most of them are about an hour in length, some of them a little bit more. We also have 10 liberators. These are U.S. Army personnel. These are all people who settled in South Carolina. And these filming was done in the mid-90s. So they look a little dated in terms of how they look, but they're still very high quality. And 2 witnesses, including one of which who used to be a member, Peter Becker. He used to be a member of the Hitler Youth, the gentleman there in the bottom left. And later on, after he immigrates to South Carolina after the war, he actually becomes the chair of the history department at the University of South Carolina. It's a fascinating story, to say the least. But a lot of great stories there. We also have a traveling trunk project. We will come to your school and bring a trunk full of books, some of which are at least two of them will be a full class set of books for teachers to use, as well as lesson plans. And we conduct a PD with the teachers, and then we'll leave it there with you for 3 to 4 weeks at your school, and then we'll come back and pick it up. Okay, and that's practically free. We really pay for pretty much everything. And if you have it for 3 years in a row, you get to have your own. You get to apply to have your own permanently at your school. So that's another incentive as well. Last year we had, I think, 5 schools. We started in the middle of last year. We only had 5 schools use it last year. This year we have 20. So it's becoming much more popular, and I go all throughout the state delivering the trunk and then go and pick it up and all sorts of stuff.
What are the age ranges for the
Great
books
question.
and the trunk?
Okay, great. So we have 3 different levels of the trunk. We have an elementary, a middle, and a high trunk. The elementary is really geared towards 5th grade because that's where the standards are located for teaching the Holocaust. Okay. And then the middle is just middle and high. Yep. Great question. Professional development, we have book clubs, we have annual summer institutes for free graduate credit for any K-12 educator. That includes librarians as well as teachers. We have one foundation of teaching the Holocaust, and another one special topics this year focusing on South Carolina and the Holocaust, looking at the Holocaust from the lens of South Carolinians. What were we thinking? How are we viewing it? That sort of stuff. And we're accepting applications now for both of those. Those are both 3 graduate credit hours from the University of South Carolina, and we pay for the whole thing. Okay. If you're outside of Columbia area, because that's where we host it, if you're outside the Columbia area, we will pay for you to stay in a hotel for 4 nights to attend that institute. And so we have teachers actually that are coming back after last year that attended both institutes last year. We have teachers coming back to attend the second one this year. So our special topic ones changes every year. Last year we had geography of the Holocaust. This year we're having South Carolina and the Holocaust. So different course every year basically. So great opportunities there. We also have trips to Poland. We're just starting up again this summer and next summer. New applications for next summers will be going out for the summer of 2024 because the summer of 2023 trip is already booked. The applications for next summers will go out probably in a couple months. So people who are interested in that. We provide scholarships that basically cover about half the cost of the trip. And fall, spring, one-day workshops, different times in the year. Typically, we had one in Charleston this past fall, and then we just had one in actually Charlotte at the Stan Greenspan Center in February, and we just had one at Furman University in Greenville last week. We also have grants that we offer to teachers, educators, librarians as well. We gave out over $40,000 worth of grants last year. Easy to apply for. There's no deadline. You can apply anytime. And we usually get you a response within about 2 weeks. So you could literally, even after 2 weeks after you've applied, you can actually have books at your doorstep if you want to get books. So there's other resources too that you can potentially get. If you want field trips, all this sort of thing. If you're not familiar, there's an Anne Frank Center here now at the University of South Carolina. It's an amazing little museum there. So definitely take a look at that. But we've also helped to fund field trips there, and also they have a traveling exhibit as well. So those are just some of the grants we have. Pretty much anything you want to do that you think you want to do, you can come to us. It's Holocaust related. We can work with you to see what we can make happen. And then we honor teachers who are dedicated to this particular topic and teaching it. And up to three teachers each year are awarded and recognized for their efforts. So that's just a little synopsis of what we do. I think that's my time. I know is really constrained, but try to get through a lot of things. Just hopefully get you something to think about as you're thinking about text selection, you know, for your libraries and or your classes, and think about also potentially things to think about talking to your teachers about too. You know, how are they going about things? Certainly, we know that the tests are always at the forefront of their mind, and that makes sense. But it doesn't mean you can't still work in other aspects of things as well. Thanks so much for being here. If you wouldn't mind taking a quick survey just to give me a little bit of feedback, I'd really appreciate it. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
I'm actually in the process of applying for one of your book grants.
Awesome.
Right now, it's on my admin's desk.
Great. I love to hear that. Great. We still have money left for this year, so
Great.
yeah, get those requests in soon.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Crystal.
That was great.